Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Before we get started, you'll be able to ask questions on the Slido platform. Go ahead and use the QR code or the link in the chat to access the platform, and feel free to ask questions throughout. We will have a 20-minute question and answer session following the presentation. Wonderful. We are very excited to have HAI fellow Lisa Simon present today. Lisa is a postdoctoral researcher in economics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business in the lab of Professor Susan Athey. Her research focuses on the future of work and how individual workers adapt to change using econometrics and machine learning methods. She uses state-of-the-art methods as well as data sources from the US and Europe to answer these questions. Previously, Lisa completed her PhD in economics at the University of Munich in Germany. Her dissertation analyzed individual determinants of labor market outcomes, such as the impact of structural change on education and occupation choices. She has worked at the IFO Institute, Germany's top policy think tank and research institute, as well as the OECD, the French Ministry of Health, and the European Parliament. Today, she will be presenting on adapting to the future, worker career transitions. This work encompasses two projects on better understanding how different workers move across jobs and the implications for policy. Take it away, Lisa.
Well, thanks so much for this great introduction, Sarah, and thanks so much for agreeing to moderate this talk. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so let me just take this opportunity to thank HAI for having me here, and especially for enabling this research by funding my postdoctoral scholar position and fellowship position. And I also want to extend my thanks to Susan Athey for obviously allowing me to work in her lab and work on and collaborate on this awesome research. So my talk today is focusing on how workers adapt to the future and how they can transition into more stable careers. That is arguably a really timely topic because especially this year with COVID, I think the need for the ability to being able to adapt to change has really been underlined. And COVID has also emphasized the dichotomous effect that technology can have on the labor market. So if we think about how probably most of us have been able to transition to working from home fairly smoothly, that obviously has been made possible by technology and especially AI-enabled technology. The flip side of that is that of course, many thousands of firms needed to lay off or furlough millions of workers. And in order to survive, they might be accelerating at adapting labor replacing technologies. So even if this or when this pandemic subsides, some workers might not have a job to come back to. So this need to understand how workers can transition is really quite timely. Let me start at a quick look at what the economics or labor economics literature has to say about the impact of technology on labor markets, because it's actually a fairly well-established field. So this literature has started out by looking at the impact of computerization and automation more generally on the labor market, and has found that computerization replaces routine tasks and therefore impacts those occupations that are particularly heavy in these tasks. And that's why we've seen sort of a decrease in the labor demand for middle skill, routine and manual occupations since the 1980s. When we look at robots, for example, there's also some literature on the impact of robots and how one industrial robot replaces 3.3 workers. It's obviously always nice to have these very precise numbers that we can put onto such an effect. But obviously a robot is easier to count than AI. So what is the impact of AI on the labor market? It's a little bit more fuzzy, right? So it's harder to count or to quantify. But of course, the impact of AI, this literature has been spearheaded by our very own Eric Brynjolfsson here at Stanford and a senior fellow at HAI, who finds that many occupations have the potential to be replaced by, many tasks within occupations have the potential of being replaced by AI, but it is unlikely that a whole occupation gets replaced. But obviously there's different degrees to which an occupation might be impacted. Also, former Stanford researcher Michael Webb, former PhD student, has found that AI might also have stronger effects on sort of more white collar, more service oriented workers. I think the favorite example is a radiologist. What is a radiologist good at? Well, pattern recognition. That is also what AI is good at. Hence, radiologists might be more affected. Should we therefore stop training radiologists? Well, I'm not so sure. I think the truth might sort of be somewhere in between. So there's a few common themes that we know from the impacts of technology on labor markets that I think are going to be important, that are sort of the starting point of my research here. So first, we know that demand for occupations with high levels of automatable skills are decreasing. We know that skill requirements across all jobs in the economy are changing, and everyone needs to, upskill and adapt to new things they're being asked to do. Thirdly, new types of jobs are being created through technology or by technology, but they are likely very different kinds of jobs than those that are being replaced by technology. And from that arises the need for workers to need to transition into new occupations, upskill and reskill, and that likely at an increasing rate in the future. And fourth is that workers with lower levels of education in more routine and more manual occupations are still most likely the ones that are being affected the most. So is AI very different from previous technological innovations? Well, maybe it seems to be adapting or being adapted a lot faster and is disrupting a lot faster, and it might sort of impact occupations more white collar. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from what has worked in the past in terms of how workers have adapted to shocks. And secondly, the kinds of workers that will likely need help adapting are likely to be the same. So the two projects I would like to present today are firstly, how do workers respond to a negative shock? Who manages to adapt and why? And how? And who might need help adapting? And then the second project sort of zooms in to this adaptation process and asks at which granular career transitions are attainable for workers, which ones are valuable both in short term and long run, and who makes better transitions than others. So let me jump straight into that first research project of mine. This is this is joint work with, of course, Susan Athey, and then our Swedish co-authors Johan Wikström, Oskar Nordström, and Jaroslav Jakomowicz, the last one being a PhD student at the University of Uppsala. So in this project, we're revisiting a fairly well-studied question in labor economics, namely the impact of plant closures on workers. Displacement through events like plant closures and mass layoffs is actually something that impacts around 5% of all employed workers in the US each year. And I couldn't find a good number for that in 2020, but I imagine that being a multiple higher for this insane year. So why are we revisiting this question if it has been studied already? The reason being that the methods sort of available to date have only been able to discover average treatment effects or average effects of plant closures or targeted subgroup analysis. There is one notable exception to that, to what I just said. But what we're basically doing here is looking at the heterogeneous treatment effects of plant closure in a data-driven and theory-agnostic way. And that, of course, is being made possible by the amazing advances that Susan Athey has made in adapting machine learning methods to causal inference questions. And that's what we're applying here. And then that allows us to really dig into these questions that are really important for policy: who adjusts and who might need help adjusting. So in true economic seminar style, let me preview my findings really briefly for this paper. That has the advantage that you can just nod off in 5 minutes and still know what's going on. So what do we find? We find that there is heterogeneity in first-year earning losses. The average earning losses is around 25% loss in earnings in the first year after displacement for a worker. However, we find that the lowest quartile is sort of twice as large in terms of the effect than the sort of smallest treatment effect quartile. So we see effects in quartiles ranging between minus 37 and minus 18%. Who has these high and low effects then? So we see that younger, better educated individuals from growing industries with relatively lower industry wages are doing better. And older individuals from larger plants, especially in manufacturing with high tenure and in fairly low populated areas, are finding it harder to adjust and are seeing therefore larger earning losses. We're also seeing that the conditions on which on the labor market and in the industry from which a worker gets displaced really matter. So if you come from a labor market that's been performing poorly, you're more likely to have larger losses. However, we also see encouraging patterns in terms of the margins of adjustments. So there does seem to be a positive association between the effect of earnings and mobility. And so individuals with higher mobility effects see smaller earning losses, and that is particularly true from these individuals that are starting out in unfavorable labor markets. I will say that that's not causal, just a correlation at the moment. So what makes it possible that we can make these types of statements? We're using what's called generalized random forest to estimate conditional average treatment effects. That's a method developed by, as I said, Susan Athey, and basically makes possible that instead of just having this average effect of the treatment, so tau would usually be just the average, is now a tau of X, which is essentially conditional on the whole host of covariates that we're adding into the model. The way this works is basically through a non-parametric machine learning method. The algorithm splits data along its covariate space and always chooses the split that maximizes the between group difference in treatment effects. And so it does that for all the variables. That's called building a tree. And then because we don't just want to do that once, because that could give us spurious heterogeneities or overfit, we do this many thousands of times and then average across all these trees. And that's called building a forest. And that then essentially allows us to estimate a personalized predicted treatment effects. I say personalized because it's only conditional on all the covariate values of an individual. So we're using data from Sweden for this project, and we're building a fairly unique data set combining many different data sources. But it's amazing, obviously, because we have the universe of Social Security data. So everyone, subject to Social Security data, we have basically. I want to note that plant closures obviously aren't random events. So we couldn't just look at the effect of a worker from a displaced plant versus like the average on the labor market. That wouldn't work. Instead, we need to build a control group that resembles that of the treatment group, so of the displaced workers. And we do that by a propensity score matching on pre-treatment covariates so that we have a control group that statistically resembles the displaced worker group. And then we sort of follow an event type study where a worker gets displaced at year T, and then we look at your outcomes 1 year after displacement. And then we have this amazingly rich set of covariates that we put into 8 categories, just to make it a little bit easier to digest. And we always put this prefix letter in front of it so that we know straight away from which sort of family of covariates these covariates come from. So let me jump into one of the hypotheses that we have, and these are just for now average treatment effects, and no machine learning happening yet here. But do treatment effects differ by the characteristics of a workers' labor market and industry at displacement? And we do actually see that the worse sort of your industry and labor market at displacement, the higher your earning losses. So this is unemployment rate above the median, below the median. But we do also see that it seems to induce higher mobility response into different regions, which might be encouraging. All right, so let me jump into where we actually use the causal forests. So these are just the distributions of predicted treatment effects across the distribution. You could look at them and say, oh, awesome, there's lots of heterogeneities. Well, it looks like there's lots of heterogeneity, I would agree, but this definitely isn't conclusive, because without confidence intervals and without a calibration, you know, these models might just be picking up spurious heterogeneity. But it is still sort of useful to look at what the predicted treatment effects do look like. So this is for earnings, and then for regional mobility on the left. So instead, what we can do is look at it in a sort of more calibrated way. Here, this is the effects on earnings. So how much heterogeneity truly is there in treatment effects. And we use that previous model that I just showed, the predictions of treatment effects, to group people into quartiles of their estimated treatment effects, and then estimate the double robust effect in each of these quartiles. And then this plot here shows nicely that the heterogeneity isn't spurious, and we can in fact detect distinct groups across the treatment effects quartiles. And it shows us that, you know, the ones with the strongest negative effect are sort of twice as badly affected as these people up here. So next, we might want to characterize the individuals with high versus low treatment effects. And so now I'll show you 3 slides that basically all look like this, that have these nice, nicely color-coded plots. What it is the mean covariates within each of these treatment quartiles. So remember, these are the people with the worst outcomes. These are the people with the best outcomes. And this just tells us what they look like on average. And the more green, sort of the closer together to the mean of the overall distribution these numbers are, and the sort of more different these colors are, the further away from the mean they are. So there's more variation. So here we see that older individuals in more routine jobs in local labor markets with higher unemployment trends and worse industry trends are seeming to be doing the worst. Secondly, individuals from local labor markets with higher manufacturing shares, from industry with worse long-term employment trends, and plants, so larger plant sizes, are also doing worse than others. And lastly, on this side, we also see that workers from with higher industry and firm tenure, as well as general labor market experience and less years of schooling, are doing the worst. They also seem to be less mobile in the past, so this number of moves is lower. And the aggregate unemployment rate, so the national unemployment rate, is also higher in the years where these individuals with the worst effects get displaced. So that's obviously like a whole lot of things to take in, but it's really amazing that we can actually make these statements. So before I showed you what basically the characteristics of people with high and low effects are, we can also flip this exercise around and say, okay, so what actually happens if we to the treatment effect if we change a variable? So this is what we do here. How do the previous planned characteristics affect treatment effects? And basically I hold all other variables constant, and we just vary the previous wages planned. The previous planned wages, and on this axis the plan size trends over the past years. And we see firstly that the individuals with who were in high wage plans, so those in sort of firms with high wages on average, are actually seeing the largest negative effects, which makes sense because obviously it will be harder for them to get a job that pays as well again. But interestingly, these effects are larger or the worst sort of the planned trajectory has been in the past. And the opposite is also true, where workers with lower wages in their plans before, but on a more positive trend, see smaller negative effects. So there's these like really interesting interaction effects, so that it's not just about high versus low wages, but that there is truly these differential effects. So now we want to turn to this question of how actually earnings, the effect of earnings and the effect on regional mobility co-move essentially. What we're doing in this slide is basically showing the joint distribution of the effect on earnings and mobility. So basically each dot here is an individual and placing them on their effect on earnings and mobility, and the higher the lighter the number, the more people there is in there. And the line also shows the correlation between these two distributions. And we do see that the association of higher mobility effects and smaller earning losses is stronger in labor markets with worse long-term trends in terms of industry employment. So I should have mentioned this, obviously 2 plots here, and we basically split the sample in half by the condition on the local labor market. This is a good, this is a bad labor market. This is a bit better one. And people are moving away from worse labor markets, and it looks like sort of they're being rewarded by smaller earning losses for that. But that's again just an association and not a causation. So then we were curious to see whether that's just an effect of population density. So if we split the sample by people from highly populated versus low populated areas, is that just picking up basically Stockholm versus the rest? And that doesn't seem to be the case. So sort of this clean distinction that we had on the previous slide isn't the case here, which sort of suggests it's really about the structure of the industry of the local labor market and not just about population density. So I'll wrap up talking about this particular project here. I will just point out that obviously heterogeneity really matters when we're evaluating the responses to shocks and where policy should focus on where to help. So next up in this project, we really need to better understand both the short-term and long-term response pathways that individuals can take and what actually works in dealing with shocks, and that might be different for the short-term and the long-term. And in order to do that, we will want to estimate sort of joint response pathways for different things people can do. What is obviously missing here, and I'm obviously teeing myself up for my next project, is that ideally we would also want to know what people do in terms of their occupational transitions. So what does the person displaced from the manufacturing plant do next? However, occupations aren't actually well recorded in this particular data. So that leads me nicely to my next projects on labor mobility, career transitions, and unrealized potential. And here we're actually also back on the US labor market. This project is joint work, again with Susan Afey, as well as Lilia Chang, who's a master's student, and Karthik Rajkumar, who's a PhD student at the econ department. In this project, we're asking at a very, very granular occupation and education level, which transitions can individuals make? So I say occupation and education level because we're actually splitting occupations by industry, by education levels, so that a plumber with 12 years of education might have different transition possibilities than a plumber with 14 years of education. So what transitions to new labor market states, and this combination of occupation and education is what we here call a labor market state, are attainable to individuals given their current situation. And then we also, of course, want to know which of these available transitions actually make sense, which ones are valuable in the short term and long term. And lastly, who realizes good transitions? So who makes good transitions and who might need help making better transitions? So here we're showing that, and this is something that echoes what I said in the introduction, that individuals need to, or workers are increasingly needing to transition occupations more often. And that's actually a trend that we can observe slightly over the past 3 decades, that occupational transitions are becoming more common over time. So again, let me explain a little bit more about these labor market states and what a transition is. So a labor market state is a granular occupation by years of education, and that adds up to around 4,000 labor market states. So we're really talking about a pretty granular level. And then we're saying that each year an individual I in starting state S, so starting state is basically his labor market state that he starts out with, can make a choice about his next end state and labor market state. And that of course includes his own. So you know, he can transition back into his own state, if you will. Of course, not everyone can make all the 4,000 transitions, right? So the plumber can't become a dentist. So we're not even offering him that possibility. So we do restrict that choice set to things that sort of we observe more than once in the data. And the goal here is to get really personalized prediction of transition probabilities for individuals. Here's a visualization of this transition matrix we're estimating. So you see really very, very granular, but this is just the average probabilities for starting and end states. And our goal is actually to have this basically separately for females and males, for people with 50 years of education and 10 years of experience and education, and so forth. So that's basically why what we're doing is hard, and why we need machine learning and dimensionality reduction techniques to arrive at our goal. So the challenge is obviously a massive and sparse matrix, thousands of choices, millions of individuals making them, but most individuals don't actually make most transitions, right? So most people never choose most occupations, if that makes sense. So we need techniques for dimensionality reduction, which basically means that we're describing the labor market states really well, and then they can share information across from one another. So that it doesn't matter if we don't have one person filling one of these cells, we can borrow from someone that looks similar like him. And then that allows for personalized transition predictions despite this data sparsity. The way we're achieving this is by essentially putting this framework into a discrete choice model, and then we use recent advances in estimating such discrete choice models, of course, spearheaded by Susan Afey and her co-authors. So what this essentially allows us to do is to estimate this discrete choice model that has all these latent factors that are basically done by matrix factorization, and also a lot more personalized sort of coefficients or latent coefficients on these covariates. So this gives us really a highly personalized model. Does this model work? So we tested against a more sort of baseline model, one that we might sort of see more frequently in economics, a conditional loaded model that I put down here, essentially how that differs from the previous Bayesian random utility model is that it doesn't have these latent factors and the same level of personalization. And we do see that our model outperforms the more standard model. So meaning we're getting better predictions. The data we're using for this project, at least in this variation I'm showing right now, is the current population survey. We basically reshuffle the data in such a way that we keep 2 observations per individual 1 year apart, so that we have like 1 transition per individual. Obviously, let me note that right here, that might not be the ideal data set, in the sense that maybe we would want to see people transitioning multiple times. So we are currently in the process of adding that and extending our models to be able to deal with worker histories. And we're doing that on online resume data and the NLSY. But it's been really useful to train the model on this 1 transition first. So we have these labor market characteristics, which basically describe the mean characteristics of individuals within their state, the industry and occupation, task, and so on. So everything that describes the occupation and education cell. And then also individual characteristics, the sort of standard demographics and so on, that enter as this distance measure from the individual to the potential end state. And then once we sort of know and have the good predicted probabilities for each from each starting state to end state, we also want to know, well, which ones are actually good end states to be in, and is it worth switching, essentially. And we have 2 types of earnings. So short-term earnings are just the mean earnings in these potential end states in 2010 US dollars. And we also do long-term earnings. And these are basically lifetime values that are calculated as the discounted present value of a labor market state J, given all the future probabilities that are possible from that end state. So what that means is that lifetime values for when you're really early on in your career are higher because you still have a lot left to earn, while at the end of your career, that number is smaller because you have less left to earn. So that's just a little bit confusing, so bear that in mind. And then we thought, okay, so how can we test whether we can actually see what alternatives individuals have available? Well, let's look at occupations that are really doing badly, that are shrinking in demand. And so here's an example of 10 occupations that have seen negative employment growth for the past 10 years and are projected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to also see negative employment growth for the next 10 years. And then I'm actually picking the data entry keyers with projected 25% employment shrinkage, essentially, as my example that I wanted to show here. So let's see what are the most lucrative transitions a 45-year-old data entry keyer can make based on our predicted probabilities and his sort of best short-term and long-term earnings. So this is sort of the top 5 transitions this person can make. He starts out as a data entry keyer in time T, earning 22,000 US dollars in 1 year. And then he can, with only a probability of 1.3%, but still become a claims adjuster and make 41% more. Sort of slightly more likely transition seems to be computer operators with 6.1%, and that gives them 26% in 1 year short-term earnings more. And interestingly, also might not be sort of added that here on the side. It's not sort of his top choice, but he can also stay data entry here and have 1 more year of education. That's not mega profitable in the short term, but it does seem to give him like good options for improving his longer term outcomes in terms of lifetime values. All right, so then we saw that, for example, this data entry here can make all these transitions potentially, so at least there's the possibility. Then we can ask who actually makes those best transitions, who realizes their potential by making the most advantageous transitions. And so we define this unrealized potential here, which is essentially the difference between the maximum potential earnings someone could be making given their state and the earnings they actually choose in the end state that they're choosing. And then we run just very simple linear regressions, regressing the unrealized potential on individual characteristics. And so we do that by just a log of this gap. So that's it's basically just a gap in what you could be earning and what you actually are earning. And then this is going to be my last sort of slide with results on there that just indulge me explaining what this all means. So the first 2 columns show that, or basically show that males have smaller gaps and blacks seem to have larger gaps. So the flip side of that is, of course, females have larger gaps. So remember, it's a negative number that we're regressing this on. So a negative coefficient means that the gap is smaller. But so what actually happens if we are adding more covariates to controlling for this? So if we're adding start state fixed effects, so if we control for what occupation and education cells someone starts out with, we're still seeing that females have 17% larger gaps to males, and the same is true for blacks. If we're adding everything together into one model, that's what this shows. And we're also adding other covariates, so a whole host of demographics, starting state fixed effects again, regional effects, industry dummies, and year fixed effects. We're still seeing 16% gap for females and then a 5% gap for Black individuals. And then we've actually done this decomposition. So basically, we wanted to know what makes it adding all these covariates that this number goes down by a lot and this doesn't move all that much. And what we're seeing is that this 1% decrease is basically only due to which industry females are in. And for Blacks, we're seeing an interesting pattern where it's actually the fact that we're controlling for family status, which are things like being married or divorced or how many children they have, that brings this down. So if we're controlling for that, the Black gap is essentially only 5%. Obviously, it doesn't tell us anything as to why, or it's not causal, but it's interesting to see that these two sort of demographic groups seem to be making consistently less good transitions, even controlling for this whole host of other covariates. Again, it's not saying why or what the cause of that is. That might be preferences, it might be discrimination, glass ceilings, anything systemic. But I think it's interesting to realize that they're there, and it's also different from just the earnings gap. It's more about like moving to opportunities. So there's a few things that are left to do in this project. So next we will be incorporating past worker histories with longitudinal data. So that'll allow us to sort of look more as to what past experience matters as to what you can transition to. We will also dig into what I've just mentioned as to what is it that prevents individuals from making good transitions. And lastly, we'll want to understand more about what makes some labor market states more like others and what enables transitions into them. Then let me conclude here. So basically, we've seen with AI-enabled automation that everyone on the labor market will require the abilities to adapt. So this sort of mindset of adaptability, I think, is important for everyone. And the project, the two projects I've presented here sort of try to nitpick what that can actually mean and what we can learn from past data. So that first project focused on understanding who manages to adapt to shocks and how, and the second project explored how occupation transitions can happen and what good transitions are available to workers and who makes them. Just to sort of recap the findings, so from the first project, we've found that younger individuals displaced from growth industries in more dynamic labor markets managed to adjust better than older workers from high-paying industries, especially manufacturing. Regional mobility does seem to be a good way of adjusting away from low-growth labor markets, and that can potentially cushion earnings losses. The second project has shown that in terms of occupational transitions, there are good alternative career pathways available, even for workers in declining occupations. And looking at who comes closer to realizing their potential, we do see that there are larger unrealized potential gaps for females and racial minorities, and we need to understand why that is and how it can be addressed. So I'll stop here with my presentation. Let me just say thank you so much for zooming in. And I don't think it's too early to wish everyone happy holidays. And I hope you have a restorative rest. And now I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. We have a variety of great questions from the audience. Let's start with a question on mobility. One of your big findings is that regional mobility can mitigate bad outcomes. What are the potential implications of this finding?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I need to caution that by saying that's not a causal finding. So we don't know for sure that because you get laid off or you get displaced by a planned closure and you move, that'll automatically mean that you'll see better outcomes. We need to understand that better, but obviously the hope is that if individuals get displaced from labor markets where basically there's no hope around them, then of course moving away is going to seem to be like a good idea. And then it'll be around understanding that who might need help in doing that, because if this goes sort of back to causality questions, if you were just to say, oh look, all the workers that are moving are doing better, we can't make that statement, because the individuals that are moving might just be positively selected. They might just be more better talented, they might be more motivated, and that means they have higher earnings because of their intrinsic characteristics rather than the fact that they've moved. So you have to be careful with these statements, but yeah, obviously the hope would be to find what can mitigate these shocks.
Wonderful. One of your findings looks at heterogeneity and unrealized potential by race and gender. Clearly at HAI, we're interested in these disparate effects of AI. Why do you think these gaps are bigger for women and minorities? One questioner suggests, for example, women with children may have reduced mobility because they have to stay in place due to a kid's school. How do you consider these types of effects?
Yeah, definitely. So as I sort of pre-shadowed in my presentation, that we don't exactly know why that is. But what I can say about having children, so in that last column of the regression table I showed, I do actually control for how many children a female has. And so that gap was there despite knowing and holding constant whether someone has children and how many. So there seems to be something that goes beyond that. And I would suspect that it's really a combination of probably preferences, systemic, societal things. So, I'm not going to try to, oh, it tells me my time is up. I'm not going to try to say, oh, this is why, but I think it's really the first step is recognizing that there is, and then digging into what that might be.
Great. We have a few questions on how machine learning is important for causal inference in this particular context. I was wondering if you could summarize a little bit more about the methods and the advances that these methods make.
Yeah, definitely. So I think what's when you're thinking about causal effects, basically the problem you're always facing is that you don't know the counterfactual, right? So if I want to know what the impact of going to school for one more year for that one person is in terms of his future earnings, then what I would ideally want is duplicate that person and put him into two scenarios at once, right? So classically in economics, we've found sort of ways around that to statistically approach that. And what machine learning can do is basically help nail that counterfactual a little bit better, because you can also think about this potential outcome problem as a prediction problem. And if you're really good at predicting the counterfactual for someone with like a really rich data set, then that might allow you to have those causal effects in a better way. The method I've used today for causal forest is basically the idea of splitting the covariate space, and always, so it goes, the algorithm basically goes through, okay, age, what's the difference? Where's the difference the largest in terms of treatment effects? Oh, it looks like it's 45. And then that split is there. Previously, what we could have done is, we can split the sample into 45-year-olds and less than 45-year-olds. But then that'll only give us sort of, you're splitting the whole sample, and that means that you're also like getting all the other characteristics of 45-year-olds. They might have other political views, and they might have like a whole other things. And so that's where machine learning is helping to sort of isolate these effects better.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There's a lot of questions about policy implications for workforce training and wage insurance. So in light of your findings, what type of workforce training is optimal for protecting the incomes of dislocated plant workers? Or are there policies to create sort of dignified or more dignified jobs?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. It also comes back to this fact that we're studying the treatment effects of plant closures in Sweden, which is obviously a country that is heavily has a very good social security network, and also why maybe these lower effects. And sorry, I'll get to workforce training in a second, but I think it's a good point to make. We're seeing sort of the most negative shocks being 40% for people in Sweden. These shocks might be a lot worse, and we sort of in fact know that they are worse in places where there's no social security network. So first, people might be forced to go back to work a lot faster. So this like initial employment shock might be actually smaller in countries like the US with sort of less protection. But people might, if you're really like depending on getting a new job, then you might just take the next best job, and then there might be a mismatch, and then you'll have like worse sort of lifetime outcomes in terms of what occupation you chose. And I think that sort of gets a little bit at that question as to what do we need in terms of workforce training. I think we need to have sort of modules in place that first recognize the skills that workers already have. And I think that's why we're doing this like transition research, because we want to know like what are the transitions that actually make sense. So I don't believe in this a little bit Silicon Valley story that truck drivers can become data scientists. No, they probably, that's a bit of a far shot. But what skills do truck drivers already have that could, with a little bit of extra training, maybe a little bit of like administrative or logistics training, maybe they can become like logistics administrators or something like that. So I think taking the individuals, taking stock of people's skills and designing like piecemeal trainings that maybe are possible while people are at work, while they're taking care of their kids, to put them into their next sort of stable jobs. And then obviously I think there needs to be a conversation around sort of benefits, like getting benefits loose of having a job and all of that. But I mean, I don't want to open that can of worms, but I think that's sort of lurking in the background.
Absolutely. So I think related to the question or your response to that last question about modules, there's a question about skill verification. So first, is this research being commercialized? And also, how do you see skill verification being flushed out as a next step for these recommendations and analyses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this isn't commercialized as we speak. Maybe if it's like gets finalized to a point where we're super confident about all these recommendations of transitions. I will say that in our lab, I'm personally not working on this project, but we do have a project working on sort of online course verifications, I believe. With a large sort of online course provider. So I think that's really one of the big next things in education is like getting certification right, probably getting a little bit away from, four-year colleges. Not that four-year colleges will always be there, but just having more choices for individuals that need to reskill mid-career. It's just not feasible for people to go back to university for years, probably nor is it necessary. So having these, modularized training available that are credibly accredited, not accredited, but they need to be credible signals. So signaling is, I think, an important topic here. That it actually means to the employers that you've completed this course. It has to mean something.
Absolutely. So one of the things you just spoke about was the differences between the Swedish and, say, U.S. labor markets, and the bottom half or the lower tail of earnings losses. One of the things that you focused on in your presentation was the emphasis on first year earnings changes. So the difference between when you just lost your job and where you stand now. What do you think of sort of different profiles of earnings changes across occupations?
Can you elaborate what you mean by profiles of earning loss?
Yeah, so do you imagine that there are some jobs in which you have low or a big change in your first year, but those profiles are sort of upward sloping versus more flat in terms of earnings changes?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So generally, just looking at first year earnings is sort of, a first sort of very clean way of looking at this research. Of course, we're also in the process of looking at sort of later year earnings, and that's also going to be especially important in looking at people that do actually, for example, move in 1 year after displacement. How do their earnings look 3 years later? But to your question in terms of profiles, yeah, I do believe that some people fall first harder than others, but they might rebound better. I don't think that's something we're necessarily seeing. So I think individuals that fall harder sort of continue to like have a harder recovery. But of course, with the safety network and social safety network available, people can maybe take that little bit more time to see, what their next gig is going to look like. So yeah, but I mean, it's a fact that these manufacturing jobs are disappearing, and these older men in manufacturing jobs just seem to have a harder time at finding new jobs, and that's not surprising. I think that's what we've seen with the trade shocks in the US. So you can't leave this piece of the population behind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have some questions about firms and what firms can do. So the first one is, what do you recommend to AI companies in terms of incorporating workers into their work and alleviating fears with respect to technology? And relatedly, I think that there's also a good question about the possible need to quote unquote go slow on introducing displacing technology. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think obviously we're at HAI. We think that AI, it's nothing inherently bad. So obviously, I'm a big believer in the fact that technology can do so much for us if we let it, and if we sort of guide as to what we let it do, right? And that also sort of pre-shadows that second question. I think what companies can do is to think about which technologies they want to introduce, and show that the tasks that are basically being taken off the shoulders of employees might have been just a task that you didn't want to do anyway. So maybe we're talking about like scheduling or transcript, like typing up transcripts, so that personal assistants can focus on optimizing and doing just something maybe a little bit more interesting. Of course, that's easy to for me to sit here and say that. So obviously there needs to be a lot of hand holding, and sort of going slow is probably the right approach. And then on that sort of, what do we adapt? I think Professor Asimoglu from MIT has some very good thoughts on this, where we look at, how do we tax labor? How do we tax machines? And obviously these two things are like vastly different. So, we as a society can also have this conversation as to, maybe we should tax these robots or whatever machines you're wanting to introduce a little bit more, so that we're placing a different value on work again. So I'm not saying we should do that, but I'm saying we can have this conversation. And I think it's worthwhile to remember that, technological progress doesn't just happen. People also need to adapt it, and companies obviously do have a say in what they're adapting. But of course, money speaks and money wins. So we need to think about where incentives are created to adapt certain things, and how basically, I think we need to keep the dignity in work and recognize that working gives self-worth to individuals. But that's why I've been doing this research and understanding the transitions people can make, even if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think there are some questions about specific occupations. So aren't many manual occupations resistant to AI because of their dexterous nature? And then some questions about the financial services industry in particular, and AI in the financial services industry. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about specific occupations and or industries.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's interesting, because I think it goes back to sort of my first slide as to what the economics literature has thought is a replaceable task by technology. And that obviously has changed so much over time, right? So, you know, I think 20 years ago, it was sort of hoovering or like vacuum cleaning was probably something that everyone would have thought, oh, you know, that's not replaceable. You need to know where the nooks and crannies of your of your living room are. Well, and here we are, you know, vacuum cleaning little robots that see where they're going are pretty common by now. I still don't have one. I should. I really need one. But that just makes you think about like, you know, can manual or tasks be replaced by technology? I think there's just no limits to what is possible potentially. So if you're thinking about, I think the things that are maybe hardest to automate at the moment are really the things where you need like super specialized knowledge about, you know, a mechanism and how to repair it. I think these are the instances that are probably very hard to put into an automatable program. But who knows, right? If AI systems learn, and the thing with AI systems is they you know, they're reinforcing, so they're learning more as the more data you give them. That's envisageable. In terms of financial service industry, I think that's really one big industry that is going to, I mean, obviously I'm speculating here, but I would assume that that is going to be strongly impacted. We're already seeing that bank tellers are really decreasing in terms of occupations. So, you know, everyone has their bank in their pocket, basically on the phone app. So the sort of those like lower, you know, face-to-face interaction occupations are definitely going out of demand. Then in terms of like the higher level trading, you know, financial assets type work, I think there's also a lot going on already, where I think we're to see as to how much, you know, are we getting rid of the investment banker? Who knows?
Perfect. Well, on that note, I wanted to thank you for sharing your amazing research with us, Lisa. Let's give Lisa a round of applause.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Of course. A copy of this presentation or this video will be available on the HAI YouTube channel. And so if you or your friends missed it or you wanted to share, you can certainly do so at a later point in time. Thank you again, Lisa. And thanks to the audience for your amazing questions. Really enjoyed this presentation.